When I first graduated from college, I had a boss that, to be honest, was a lot wiser than I gave him credit for at just 25 years old. One of the things he said to me, though, did stick with me and has stuck with me all these years. He said, when your reaction to a situation doesn't match the situation itself, that very often says more about you than it does about the situation. It's something that it's part of that core bit of wisdom that I try to live my life by. And I've seen it come up a lot in the last several months. It started with, I went to a counselor for a few sessions over the summer. And he introduced me to this idea of negative self-beliefs. I'd never heard this term before. But it's these deeply held convictions that negatively impact what you do or your sense of self. Things like, I'm not worthy of love, or I don't deserve happiness, or I am a failure. Even though it wasn't something that I personally struggled with, this idea that people that have these ideas in their mind that they believed, and the thing was that he shares, like, you may not even be aware that you really believe these. And I started tying it into this idea that I got from my boss so many years ago. And then I came across several videos just in the last few weeks that have really driven me wanting to make this particular video itself. The first one was from a man named Dr. Bruce Lipton. He was talking about the difference between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. And he said the conscious mind is one of wishes and desires, the mind that we use to actively focus on things, to actively pursue what we want. And that the subconscious mind is one of programming. There was another video that I came across, a man by the name of Dr. Price Pritchett. He said, what do you think gives you more mileage in trying to improve your life? Is it less negative thinking, or is it more positive thinking? And what he said is that the studies are unequivocal, is that it's less negative thinking. And he also said something, what was it? As much as 70% of our negative thoughts go unperceived by us. Now, if that's the case, you combine it with this idea of negative self-beliefs. If you have this in your mind that I'm not worthy of love, for instance, and you're not aware that you're saying that to yourself the vast majority of the time, think about how that would impact your life. And then I came across this video by Dr. Paul Conti. He was on the Diary of a CEO podcast, and he was talking about the different types of trauma. That's one I want to share with you guys. Let's take a listen here.
What are the different types of trauma? Are there sort of different categorizations of trauma from like small to big, or?
If we're using the definition that trauma is anything that overwhelms our coping mechanisms, so there are changes in the brain when our coping mechanisms are overwhelmed, and on the other side of that, our brains are different. So that's the biological definition.
So there's a biological definition of trauma as something that overwhelms our coping mechanisms and actually changes our brains so that on the other side of the trauma, our brains are different. And in as much as our selves are contained within our brains, and I know that's a whole other metaphysical kind of question there, but it's certainly not nothing. Our brains are determining our sense of self on some level. We become different people on the other side of trauma.
Then we would look at, well, how do we get there, right? And it breaks down into three categories then of acute, chronic, or vicarious. So the acute trauma is how we've traditionally seen trauma. So if you think about the idea that people were shell-shocked after World War I, right? That was acute trauma, combat trauma. So our traditions of looking at trauma come from acute trauma, and it's just more evident, after someone dies or there's an injury or there's a car accident, we can see that, oh, okay, gosh, that could what makes some difference in the person. Like we can kind of get that. And sometimes we can see the change in the person from before and after. So we have tended to equate trauma and post-trauma syndromes, like what happens to us after those changes in the brain are now with us, to acute trauma.
This part was really eye-opening for me, is that our traditional understanding of what trauma was centered around acute trauma. You have this traumatic experience in a moment, in an instant. It changes who you are. Your brain is changed, and you come on the other side of that and you're different.
Do those changes in the brain happen in other ways? And the answer to that is yes. That if a person is seen as less than, for example, in a society, for whatever reason, across time, or even within a household, a person is being abused in a household, a child is being neglected, or a child is being emotionally or physically abused.
Bullied at school?
Sure, bullied at school, absolutely, right? So nothing happens all at once, right? But that brain changes just the same. So it's a scientific definition of traumatic change, and it is true in situations of chronic trauma, just as it is in acute trauma.
Nothing happens all at once, but that brain changes just the same. Now think about the range of things that they talked about as examples there. One is being seen as less than, all the way up to emotional and physical abuse, and mentioned bullying in between there. It's like these are things that can happen or typically do happen over time. But the chronic buildup of that, the cumulative effect, is changes in the brain that are very similar to that acute trauma, that PTSD, that shell shock kind of trauma. As I thought about these ideas, I came across a number of stories that demonstrated this in a very real way for me. One of which is my own story. I shared in the last video that I'm struggling making friends. One of the things that I didn't share in that video is that I've had years of, to use his term, chronic rejection from people in one form or another. Not outright saying it, but by their actions or other words saying that we just don't want to be around you. And it took me a while to understand. It was really this year that I started to understand that the chronic effect of that was not necessarily a negative self-belief, because it didn't change how I saw myself. But it was a limiting negative belief, because I would go into potential friendship situations and I would find myself thinking, and again, this is hindsight. I'm not aware of this in the moment, but in hindsight, I could be like, this is just going to fail. So why even bother? Another story is from this woman that I've known for a few years now. She told me a while back that as a child, she was verbally abused by her parents. Told her repeatedly that you're not good enough. You're not smart enough. There's no point in you trying to accomplish anything with your life because you're not smart enough to do anything worthwhile. There's no point in going to college. You can't handle it. I think about the effect that would have on somebody over the course of years of growing up. But the way she dealt with that after the fact is that she swung to the other end of the spectrum, to the point where nobody can tell her anything that sounds even remotely like criticism. No advice, no, hey, you could have done that better. It doesn't matter what the strength of relationship you have with her. She can't hear it. And then there was this guy that he lived with me for a brief period of time a number of years ago. And it's one of the main reasons why I wanted to make this video. He called me out of the blue not too long ago. And before I go any further, I want you to know that I asked his permission to share this story. And he's like, yeah, absolutely. I think it could help people. But I am still going to keep it high level just to protect him. But he called me up one day and he said, Jason, I messed up bad. And so we were talking about it. He told me this story of how he was sleeping one day and he woke up to find his girlfriend going through his phone. Now, that aside, I'm not going to make any judgment calls on that. I don't know her. I don't know the situation. All I know is what he told me about his reaction. And his reaction was way over the top. Very much a not good, just way over the top reaction. By his own admission. And that was why he was calling me. He's like, Jason, that's not the kind of person I want to be. That's not who I feel like I am. And we talked about it for a while. And at one point, he used the word betrayal to describe that situation. And that word was interesting to me because from what he told me of the story, I don't feel like I would have thought of it as a betrayal. I'd have been like a little irritated by it for sure, but I don't know that I would have associated the word betrayal with it. And so I started asking him, it's like, well, is there other times that you felt betrayed? And he started telling me story after story. Most of them former girlfriends of his, where the situation would end or because of betrayal, what he described as betrayal. And the further back we went, we eventually landed on this story from his childhood, where his dad completely upended his life, moved him several states away from his friends and other family. There wasn't any kind of abuse or anything like that, but just literally completely upended his world without talking to him about it ahead of time. And I don't know his dad's point of view on this. I just know what he told me, but from his child perspective, it was a significant event that he associated with the feeling betrayal. He knows this, and I'll tell you guys this. I'm not a psychologist. I haven't received training in this, but to me, those pieces seemed kind of obvious to fit together. And here's what I said to him. It's like, it's possible that because you never really dealt with that every time you have something in your life happen that looks even remotely like betrayal, you bring all of those past hurts, all of those past feelings into that present moment and place all of it on that particular situation. And he thought about that and he was just like, his eyes got big and he's like, oh my goodness. And just, it resonated with him quite a bit. And I told him, man, you need to go back and write this stuff down, explore what happened with your dad from now that you're an adult. Go back and look at it. It's like, what were you feeling? What were you thinking? What did you believe about yourself and about that situation that maybe you've carried through these years that are now causing you to have this really bad reaction to somebody just looking at your phone? And it brought it back to my mind of that lesson from my boss. His reaction didn't match the situation. That's why I kept digging with him. This is why I think there are a number of reasons why it's important to deal with trauma, but I think this is pretty high up there on the list, is understanding the why of things so that it doesn't impact who you are today. That you can be your best self, free from whatever hurt or pain you felt in the past. And as I was researching for this video and just kind of gathering my thoughts, I came across this other video that I want to share with you guys. It's Dr. Jordan Peterson. And he's on this podcast. What's this guy's name? The Sean Ryan Show. And I want you to listen to a little bit of what Dr. Peterson had to say about this very thing.
If you've encountered something traumatic, it's like there's an abyss in your life and you had fallen into it. And the reason you're still upset about that is because you don't know why you fell into it. And so your brain, your mind, your soul is warning you. It's like, you fell into a pit, buddy, and you don't know why. And so you could fall into it again. And so I'm not going to let you forget it. You have to figure out why you fell into that pit. And if you've done something particularly terrible, then that's a very deep pit.
If you've done something particularly terrible, then that's a very deep pit. And I think that relates very much to what my friend was going through. That's what I want to encourage you guys with. Is especially as men, it is very easy for us to look at past situations that we felt hurt, they didn't go the way we wanted them to, and just shrug them off and say, okay, whatever. And if you can legitimately do that and it not negatively impact you, great. But not everybody can do that. We don't spend a whole lot of time with our emotions, typically as men. We don't spend a whole lot of time analyzing ourselves and analyzing our actions in light of who we used to be or things that happened in the past. Men typically are just nut up and deal with it, you know? And I don't think that's healthy. In fact, I know it's not healthy. And so if you find yourself in situations where you can legitimately look at it and say, you know what? I'm not being my best self in this moment, and I need to understand why. That's the first step. You've got to learn how to recognize those situations. And I want to share with you what has helped me in that regard. I call it the third-party observer perspective. This is weird. It's going to make it sound like I've got multiple personalities, but this is how I think about it. I look at my life, any given situation, from the standpoint of another person, a person who's not emotionally attached to said situation. And I analyze it. It's like, is my response, is what I said and did normative? Would a reasonable person react like that in this situation? But then the second thing is, and this is so important, very few people, and I'm not counting myself among those who can, very few people have the skills and the training and the knowledge and the wherewithal to be able to go through that process completely on their own. It's not something that's going to get better by itself. And if you can't deal with it by yourself, you need to talk to somebody. And by deal with it, I don't just mean push it aside and forget about it. These are things that have to be addressed. You have to understand the why of it, like Dr. Peterson said. Because if you don't, whether you want to or not, your brain is always going to be looking out for the next pit. You're going to be in this hyper-aware, negatively focused mode of, is there danger there? Is there danger there? Is there danger there? You have to talk to somebody. It can be a friend. It can be a family member. Depending on how traumatic the experiences were, you may need to actually talk to a professional. And that's okay. There is no shame in that. Like I said, I'm not a professional counselor, but I'm here too. If you've been through something and you want somebody to talk to, reach out to me. Leave me a comment below and I'll reach out to you. Tell me what's going on.